So my name's Yvette Hawkins, and what I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit about my practice, but also about a specific project which was inspired by museum collections. So I guess in contrast to Lyndall, my work is really more, I guess, in tune with what Sheila was saying about Mark Dion and having this museum approach to my practice as opposed to actually having worked with a collection. So I guess I want to take you on that journey of how I came about working in that way, and what it was about that inspired me to make work in that way. So my practice essentially explores language, and this idea that it's deeply rooted in the way that an audience perceives a space or perceives a piece of work. So I make large-scale installations using books and maps. So this was a piece called Their Silence a Language, and it was all about, I guess, I really wanted to control the way that people perceived text and words and language, and how this really changed the way that worked with a space. So it was really embedded in this whole idea, which Sheila again touched on, about how we see and read spaces differently. So I was interested in this whole idea of where you might see a page of words, and you're really compelled to kind of start reading it straight away, and it was about this whole process of breaking down that space. So that's what a lot of my work is about. This was a similar piece, using the same objects but in a completely different way and responding to the environment, called No Land in Particular, where I use the objects to draw within that space. And here's some works with maps as well. So I'm just going to flick through these. So I'll talk a little bit about this project, which was a project at the Gallery of Wonder in Newcastle, which was essentially a window space. And it's curated by this curator called Irene Brown, and she was really interested in the idea of wonder and how wonder comes across in museum collections. So she was doing this piece of work around inviting artists to come and present their work in a space and to think about presenting it in that very confined glass case sort of space. So the work that I have here is around the role of women in bookbinding. So there's a lot of bookbinding within my work. And because I trained in textiles originally, I was really interested in using those traditional craft techniques that you find in museum objects, but also how that could be subverted into book objects. So the whole idea about women and bookbinding is that they would only be confined to folding and stitching. And I found this really fascinating, that the final object that you get was this kind of encased, covered book, which was done by men, and that you never saw this beautiful stitching that happened. So I kind of really wanted to do a piece of work that showed that off. And there's another piece which shows the stitching, and this is called a kettle stitch, and this is the traditional binding of European books. And all the pages are bound around an embroidery circle, so it played with this whole idea of sewing circles, women in sewing circles, but also that it was bound around a sewing circle and without the covers on. So my installations tend to use this way of working, using these traditional craft techniques. But I was also really interested in the idea that today we're reading in really different ways. And that while at the same time I was making this environment, or these environments which presented work in a space, I was also really interested in the way that the audience interacted with that. So on one level I was working on this large scale and inviting people to respond to the space, but on the other level I also wanted to work in a smaller way and to work with objects. So what I'm going to talk about today is really a collection that isn't a museum collection, but was a collection of objects that I created. So essentially I created this museum collection. And so just touching on the idea that we're reading on phones, we're reading on trains, we're reading in all of these different spaces. And the kind of work I was making were these artist books. And what you found was that you would only see these books inside glass cases, or they were handled by curators and only came out at a certain time. And what I found, or what I wanted to get from it, was this idea of engagement, in that you would be able to handle those objects. And so because I was creating my own collection, I was also able to create some of those rules about how we interact with it, which is slightly different to how, I guess, museums might work, in that you have a lot of restrictions already. But we had that luxury to really kind of think about how we might present the work. So thinking about these books and thinking about the way things are presented, I started to look at libraries and bookshops, and how the books that we can actually touch are presented. So kind of, even though they were artist books, I wanted to bridge that gap between what libraries were doing and what contemporary art galleries were doing. So I went to libraries, and unfortunately I wasn't particularly inspired visually. And the reason for that was because they were very linear, the way that they're presented, and because they had this huge collection of works that they had to present in this way that was accessible to lots of different types of people. So I started to think, well, actually, that's not right for this project. And what I wanted to do, because I had the freedom to do it, was present it in a very different, much more visual way. So I started looking at museums, but particularly around this idea of the apothecary, and how essentially an apothecary is presenting a collection in a very visual way. And the way that I saw these artist books was that they were a collection that could be presented in any way we wanted. So I also started looking at contemporary museum display. So this is a Great North Museum. And that what I really liked about that was that you had this impact as soon as you entered the space. So this is kind of the entrance as you come in. And there were all of kind of these apothecary-style presentation that you're set out upon. But then they also tended to use new technologies, filmmaking, sound works within kind of that display. And this was, I found, a lot more inspirational to me. So the other thing about the project, I'll mention the project, it's called Book Apothecary, which is a travelling museum of artist books. And it was this whole idea that these books could be transportable. So it was really important for me to be able to present them in a way that could be transported. And then I came across this image of these suitcases. And I thought, well, so a suitcase is a bit like a book. And they're also objects that are really familiar to us, that we have these stories associated with. So it was quite evident that I wanted to present these works quite clearly within this kind of framework. So these are some images now of the exhibitions that we've done. So I invited 4 other artists to come and make work within suitcases that responded to the book format, and I was really open to how that might work. So rather than have these traditional format books, we were also working with new technologies. So it was around this idea of perhaps a series of objects might tell a story in the same way a book tells a story, and is that a book? And so we kind of questioned all of those things as well. So here are some of I'll just flick through these. This was an exhibition in an old train station sort of house called Stevenson Works. And it's a listed building where artists can go in and create interventions. And what was really interesting about this project was that we had the ability to present these outside of the museum or gallery environments, and also think about how we might present the works in different ways. So the other thing that we did was we went on a train station tour. So we took the objects out where you might not find art, but in spaces where you might find suitcases. And what we found was that people were really engaged with that. So they went up to them straight away, and it was really clear that we didn't want to present them in these white box gallery kind of spaces, because we wanted that level of engagement, and we wanted people to pick up and touch these pieces. So this doesn't look like a book, but it is a poem inside a radio, and the whole idea is that you can tune the radio into different stations which present a different part of the poem. So it was all about engaging them. First of all, I love this image of this boy that was captured, that he was really engrossed in this poem. Here we are on our library tour. So we bought one of those big hotel trolleys, and just started transporting them around. So this was a library in Blythe. This was a terrible photo shoot that they made us do. Our funders sent along this photo and made us have a photo shoot at a train station. And then, so we made all of these works, and some of the works are coming, so I'll explain some of those a bit later on. We made all of these works, and then we found that museums were interested in showing our collections. So this was an exhibition at Leicester School of Museum Studies, whereby we were invited to present works, and it was all around how artists work in museums. So again, this was actually one of the artists who came onto the project, who I didn't know at all before, presented a work which was the reverse to the women and bookbinding piece. So these are my pieces, the circular pieces, which are all of the pages that the women would make. And then this book cover was Dawn's piece, which was the reverse. So she made a piece of work about the absence of women. And we didn't know this at all before we met. And then we had this opportunity to kind of present this work together. So I'll go through some of the objects that we made. This was by an artist called James Chincharo, and he made a mechanical flick book. So he's actually a filmmaker, but because he was presented with this opportunity to make a very different sort of work, he started looking at zoetropes and those very early days of filmmaking when they started with books and flick books. And we paired him up. He was a young artist who just graduated, so we asked another artist to mentor him. So we asked Bob Levine to mentor him in his piece of work. And so the idea is that there's a handle to the side and you turn it and then you can kind of flick the books, flick the pieces. And then some of the other artists took on this whole role of the apothecary in a much more literal sense, in that the whole piece was a book, but that inside each of these bottles was a sentence of a poem. And the idea was that people could pull out these pieces and create their own narrative going through that didn't have to follow the narrative that the artist presented. So there were 16 objects altogether. This is one which was based on Darwin, and it was all around kind of this idea of categorization and how Darwin really changed the way things were categorized. So this was by a work by Tues Easton, who was one of the other artists, and she's a printmaker predominantly, and made lots and lots of different types of books, and the whole idea is that you can pick them up and touch them. And then this was a light box piece where there were single leaf pieces which you could investigate and inspect on the light box, which was all to do with different mark making and drawing. So that's I guess what I wanted to get across today was this whole idea that I came in very much as an outsider to the museum sector, I suppose, in that I was much more inspired by the way the objects in a museum were presented, and I wanted to use that within my practice. And what's come out of it was this whole new idea of the way that we read today, and that by presenting these objects within familiar spaces, it's led to our audience really engaging with this project. So now we're in a situation where we are able to take some of these cases out and deliver other projects. So we're working with schools at the moment where we're creating their own suitcase. So it's been a much more engaging way of presenting that collection.